Bonjour, welcome to French class. Today we're going to talk about the extraordinary topic of le passé composé. So, do you like le passé composé? You should love the passé composé because this allows you to speak about the past in French. So, the only thing that's sometimes troublesome is the passé composé can seem a little complicated until you really learn the rules. So, we've talked about the passé composé before. And we've talked about using avoir as helping verb with regular verbs, like the three groups of regular verbs, ERs, IRs, and REs. Okay? If you missed that lesson, you can click on it. I put a link at the bottom of the page. We also talked about using avoir with irregular verbs. It's a little more complicated, but only in the sense that you have to learn the past participles of the irregular verbs. If you missed that one, you can also click on the link that I put at the bottom of the screen. Today's lesson is going to focus on when to use the verb être as helping verb in the passé composé rather than the verb avoir. So the thing you need to remember is that in French, most of the time, almost all the time, you use the verb avoir as helping verb. However, there are some exceptions. And those exceptions are when you use the verb être and you really, really, really just need to memorize this lesson. So I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. To start out with, you really only use the verb être as helping verb with 17 verbs. It's true, okay? So you're going to have a list of 17 verbs to memorize. Why do you use être sometimes, and other times you use avoir? Here's the simple reason. You use être with a verb that is somehow, some way, got something to do with motion or a change in state. All right? So a verb of motion might be, for example, to go out, sortir. You see, that's simple enough. You can tell you're taking your body, you're moving it from one place to another. Sortir, you're going out. A verb where you have a change of state, for an example, would be mourir. You know what that means? Mourir means to die. You see what I mean by change of state? All right, so what I'm going to start out by doing is giving you the list of 17 verbs that almost always take être as helping verb, and I'll explain the almost at the end of the lesson. Okay, you know in French there's always an exception. That's what makes it such a beautiful language. All right, here's your list. And before I get started, I'm going to tell you that there's a very simple way that will help you memorize this list. Look at the very first letter of each of the verbs that I'm going to put on the screen, and at the end, you're going to tell me what that spells, what the first letter of each verb spells. And that's how you're going to remember, and that's how you're going to memorize this list. All right, so the first verb is descendre. Descendre means to go down. The past participle is descendu. The second verb is rentrer. Rentrer means to go back in. It means to return, but in the sense of going home. Rentrer almost always means to go home. Even when you look at it, it looks like re-enter, so to go back in. Je rentre means I'm going home. Okay, so the past participle of rentrer is rentrer with an accent aigu. The next verb is mourir. Mourir means to die, and the past participle is really irregular. It's mort. Mort. All right. The next one is retourner. Retourner also means to return, but in the sense of going back. So try to remember that, because in this lesson you're going to see there are many verbs that mean to return, but always in a different sense. So this one means to go back, and the past participle is retourner. because it's also an ER verb. All right, the next verb is sortir, to go out. The past participle is sorti. The next verb is partir, which means to leave. Past participle, parti. The next verb is venir, which means to come. Past participle, venu. The next verb is aller, to go. Past participle, aller. The next one is naître, to be born. Past participle, né. Devenir, to become. Devenu. Entrer, to enter. Entrer. Revenir, to come back. Revenu. Tomber, to fall. Tomber. Rester, to stay. That one's tricky. It does not mean to rest. Rester means to stay, and the past participle is rester. Arriver, to arrive. Arriver. Monter, to go up. Monter. And finally, the last one, passer, which means to pass by. Past participle, passer. So you'll notice in this list that you have the verbs venir, devenir, and revenir. Obviously, they all have something in common. They all have the root verb venir. So that can maybe help you remember how to form all of their past participles because they follow that pattern. All right, so these verbs are sometimes referred to as intransitive verbs. So if you're already in a French class somewhere and you've got a French teacher who always refers to intransitive verbs, here's what that means. It just means they're verbs that do not take objects, like a direct object or an indirect object. They never take objects, okay? So this whole list is a list of intransitive verbs. Did you look at the first letter of each verb? And can you figure out what it spells? That's kind of just a silly thing. And if you ask a French person, they've never, ever heard of this because this is something that helps people who are learning French as a second language. This is something that helps us. So the first letters of all of those verbs spell out Dr., Mrs., P. Vandertramp. I know it's silly, but that will help you. Dr., Mrs. P. Vandertramp. So one of the first things I always get my students to do after I introduce the Dr. and Mrs. P. Vandertramp verbs, because that's what I call them, the very next day in class, we have a quiz where they have to list all of the verbs with no help. They have to write the infinitive, they have to write the past participle, and they have to tell me what it means in English. So if you want to challenge yourself, give yourself until tomorrow to memorize these and then give yourself a quiz. And if you get them all right, then treat yourself to something that you really, really like. And if you don't get them all right, then you get to try again the next day, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about these verbs. To use them in the Passé Composé, you follow the same pattern as you do with avoir when you're using it as helping verb, which means you begin with the subject, like je, for example. Then you use your helping verb. Now remember, we're talking about helping verb being être. So it's not j'ai, it's je suis. And then you choose your verb. For example, if we want to say I entered, we say je suis entré. Je suis entré. Tu es entré. Tu es entré. Il est entré. Elle est entrée. Nous sommes entrés. Vous êtes entrés. Ils sont entrés. Elles sont entrées. When you look at the way those are written, you can probably see something right away that's different than when you use avoir as helping verb. What is it? All of those extra E's and sometimes S's that are added onto the past participle. Look at the je form, for example. Je suis entré. I put e in parentheses. Now, when you're really writing, you don't need to put these parentheses. The reason I put it there is because there are certain situations where you'll need to put an e. I, for example, Jennifer, am the one saying je suis entrée. Well, since I'm a woman, I have to add an e to make agreement on the past participle. What am I making agreement with? With the subject. So even though the subject is je, and that alone won't tell you if it's masculine or feminine, since you know that I'm the one saying je suis entrée, you know that je is referring to a feminine subject, so you have to add an e to make agreement. If je were referring to a masculine subject, then you wouldn't have to add anything. Same thing for tu. Tu es entré. Sometimes you need an e, sometimes you don't, depending on if the subject is masculine or feminine. Now the next two, il and elle, obviously il is masculine, so il est entré, you don't need to add an e, but elle est entrée, you will always need an e. Now look at the new form. There's lots of parentheses and e's and s's. The one thing that we know about nous all the time is that it's plural. So you see that S that I put on there. S indicates that we're making agreement with a plural subject. Nous is always plural. In the Passé Composé, when you're using être as helping verb, you'll always have to add an S to the past participle. You have an E in parentheses. Why? Because nous may be a group of girls or a group of feminine subjects. Remember, we're not only talking about people, we're talking about feminine subjects. So the subject, anyway, you know, all nouns in French are either masculine or feminine. So sometimes you need to add an E if the subject nous is referring to a group of girls. Then you have to add an E and an S. If it's a mixed group or only boys, then you don't have to add an E. Same thing for vous. Vous, you know, can be masculine, it can be feminine, and it can also be either singular or plural. That's the tricky thing about vous. So you really have to look at what vous is replacing. That's a subject pronoun, but what subject is it really replacing? If it's a group of women, vous, then you have to add an E and an S. If it's one woman, then you only have to add an E. If it's a mixed group or a group of men or boys, then you don't have to add an E, but you would still have to add an S because it's plural. All right, so just remember that about vous. Can be plural, can be singular. When would it be singular? When you're showing respect to someone. So you're using the vous form of you with them, like to a teacher, or to someone who's older than you, or to someone you don't know very well, okay? Now let's look at the il, plural. Obviously it's plural, so we have to have an S, but il is masculine, so you don't need to add an E. And then elle, plural, you have to add an S, and since we know it's a feminine subject, you also have to add an E. So I went through that kind of slowly, but sometimes it's a point of confusion, so that's why I did that. All right, so let's just come up with a few more examples using the passé composé with être. Which verb should we use? How about the verb monter? You remember what it means? Monter means to go up. So in France, what can you imagine going up? Maybe the Eiffel Tower, la Tour Eiffel. So if we want to say, I went up the Eiffel Tower. Je suis monté en haut de la Tour Eiffel. Really means I went up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. Tu es monté en haut de la Tour Eiffel. Il est monté en haut de la Tour Eiffel. Elle est montée en haut de la tour Eiffel. Nous sommes montés en haut de la tour Eiffel. Vous êtes montés en haut de la tour Eiffel. Ils sont montés en haut de la tour Eiffel. Elles sont montées en haut de la tour Eiffel. Wonderful. All right, so here's something I'm going to ask you to remember. Now you've got the être verb in your mind. You remember, oh, I've got to make agreement on that past participle. Well, remember that when you're using avoir as helping verb, you do not have to make agreement on the past participle. D'accord? It's very, very important to remember that. Okay, here's something I'm just going to go on and mention because I'm going to try to make this lesson as complete as possible. There are certain situations, certain verbs in this list of 17 verbs that can sometimes use être as helping verb and other times they use avoir as helping verb. Don't get confused. There's a simple explanation for this. The verbs descendre, sortir, monter, and passer are sometimes intransitive verbs and sometimes they're transitive verbs. Remember what that means. An intransitive verb does not take an object, but a transitive verb does. So that means the verbs descendre, sortir, monter, and passer sometimes are followed by direct objects. When they are followed by direct objects, you have to use the verb avoir as helping verb. Here's an example for the verb descendre. Je descends mes bagages. Je descends mes bagages. That's the present tense. J'ai descendu mes bagages. Mes bagages, that's the direct object. You notice I used avoir as helping verb. This verb descendre, now that it's being used transitively, has a different meaning. Intransitively, it means to go down, as we just talked about in the lesson. Transitively, it means to take down. J'ai descendu mes bagages. Or to bring down. I brought down my bags. What about the verb sortir? Intransitively, it means to go out. Now listen to it with a direct object. J'ai sorti mes livres. J'ai sorti mes livres. It means I took out my books. So the meaning changes a little bit when it has a direct object. The verb monter, as we talked about it with the verb être, it means to go up. Je suis monté en haut de la tour Eiffel. But when it has a direct object, it means something different. J'ai monté mes bagages dans ma chambre. J'ai monté mes bagages dans ma chambre. I brought my bags up to my room. And finally, the verb passer. When we talked about it before, we said passer means to pass by. For example, je suis passé par la pharmacie. I passed by the pharmacy. Or I stopped by the pharmacy. Passer, when it's followed by a direct object, can look something like this. J'ai passé un examen ce matin. J'ai passé un examen ce matin means I took a test this morning. All right, so if you have questions about that or you need some more examples, just let me know in the comments. I know this is a lot of information, but guess what? I have one more thing to tell you. So I said at the beginning of the lesson that you use être as helping verb in the Passé Composé with these 17 Dr. and Mrs. P. Vandertramp verbs, and that's it. Well, there's an exception, as always in French, but this is the only exception. You definitely use être with those 17 verbs, but you also use être as helping verb in the Passé Composé when your verb is reflexive. So if you don't know what reflexive verbs are just yet, that means you're still learning, you're still a débutant, that's fine. You don't really need to worry about this yet. And I'll make another lesson about reflexive verbs soon. But if you do know what reflexive verbs are, like se coucher, se laver, se lever, se réveiller, if you've studied them, you know what I'm talking about. When you put those in the passé composé, you must use the verb être as helping verb, and you must make agreement, just like you did with all of the Dr. and Mrs. P. Vandertramp verbs. So just to give you an example, elles se sont couchées très tôt ce soir. Elles se sont couchées très tôt ce soir. You see? All right, so that's just one example. Again, don't hesitate to ask me questions in the comments if you need some clarification or something like that. And I believe I covered everything. So give yourself a little challenge. Memorize the list of Dr. and Mrs. B. Vandertramp verbs and take a quiz tomorrow. Let me know how you do. See you soon. Au revoir.